Hi, I'm Chloe. I'm from Carbon Intelligence, and I'm going to talk to you today about the role of businesses in tackling climate change. So what we really hope you to get out of today is a good understanding of why businesses need to act. So this is why businesses as in particular, and also in the current climate scenario, why it's so important that we do act now. And then to really gain an insight into where the UK market is at the moment and how they got there. So what strategies are in place and what we do to work with businesses to get them to be ambitious with their climate targets. The latest climate science shows that we really must reach net zero if we want to avoid irreversible damage onto our climate. So current projections show that we're likely to see a 3.1 to 4.8 degrees of warming by 2100. However, global scientific consensus highlights that we can't go over 2 degrees if we want to avoid irreversible change to the environment. This is really where the Paris Agreement comes in. So it was governments committing to keep warming well below 2 degrees, but preferably be ambitious and get that to 1.5 degrees. However, the current policies in place are only going to get us to a warming of 3.1 degrees, which is much higher than where we need to be. And this is really where businesses come into play and why they are such key actors in the climate change crisis. Climate change has gained a lot of momentum over the past couple of years. It really started with Greta and the school strikes back in 2018, which was closely followed by the IPCC special report on 1.5. Another key milestone more recently was the UK committing to becoming net zero by 2050. I think this is really important because climate change, it was a really big year for climate change in 2020. The COP26 conference was supposed to take place. However, due to COVID-19, this had to be postponed. But it's really key here to understand it's not an opportunity for us to lose momentum. Climate change isn't going away. So it's really important for us to have our voices heard and ensure that climate change stays high up on the agenda. Why do businesses need to act? So I already mentioned their role with government policy. Government policy is not going to get us to reach our climate goals, so businesses really can. And there's not as much red tape for businesses, so they can be much more ambitious with their targets, which is much more challenging for governments to do. In addition, a large proportion of the environmental issues we face today are because of the way businesses operate. So they're really significant actors and big carbon hotspots as to why we are in this situation we are today. For example, the built environment is responsible for 40% of the UK's emissions. So this is looking at the buildings and the transport systems, many of which were built to ensure that businesses can operate effectively in the first place. So they're really key actors because they can bring down our emissions as they are such significant carbon hotspots. As well as this, businesses are incredibly powerful. They have tremendous power over their own operations and have the ability to instigate behaviour change with their suppliers and their customers. So they can decarbonise their own operations whilst also engaging with suppliers and customers to start looking at environmental strategies so they can set their own SBTs and really create this domino effect to ensure that this climate strategy doesn't just stop still. It kind of keeps going and keeps going with the more businesses that they interact with. As well as this, businesses need to stay competitive. It's a slightly different spin and really shows how businesses need to develop these climate strategies and engage with climate change if they are to stay where they are. So the CDP, which was previously known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is a sustainability disclosure questionnaire, highlighted that in 2020, over 500 investors were asking thousands of companies to disclose on their environmental data. If companies don't show their sustainability commitments throughout their supply chain, where this is in terms of the buildings they rent, the products they use, etc., they will really fall behind. So it's really important for them, if they are to stay competitive, to engage with climate science. How are businesses responding? What are they doing at the moment? So these are just a handful of the businesses who over the past year have publicly announced what they are doing to fight climate change. So if we start with Brewdog, so they committed and they publicly announced earlier this year that they are now carbon negative. So they've done this by ensuring that all of their bars and breweries are wind powered, and they've also purchased a 2,000-acre bit of land in Scotland, which they're going to build a forest in and also build a peatland. So this will act as a carbon capture for any emissions that they are emitting into the atmosphere. Secondly, we have the sportswear brands, so we have Adidas and Nike, and they've really looked into developing sportswear and sports shoes that look at using upcycled marine plastic and waste before it goes into landfill. So the Adidas range, the Parley range, has actually prevented almost 3,000 tons of waste from going into the oceans just through the development of their range. I think the biggest one to note here and the most significant is Microsoft. So earlier this year, they pledged to be carbon negative by 2030. But in addition to this, they also announced that they would remove all the carbon that the company has ever emitted since they were founded in 1975 by 2050. I think this is really important because although more and more companies are engaging with setting targets, they are looking into the future and how to reduce future emissions. There aren't many companies yet that have looked at historic emissions and how they can start to remove those. So hopefully Microsoft will stand in an example and businesses will start to copy them with their climate ambitions. So how are these businesses actually setting these climate scenarios and meeting these targets? So we work with businesses to help align them to the Paris Agreement through setting net zero strategies and science-based targets. So what is net zero? It's a word that's thrown around very often. The UK have committed to it by 2050, but what does it actually mean? So it looks at reducing company-wide and value chain emissions in line with climate science, whilst balancing off any remaining emissions by enhancing carbon sinks, which removes CO2 from the atmosphere. So this is kind of the offsetting once these value chain emissions have been reduced. So value chain emissions, in addition to looking at what we refer to as scope 1 and 2 emissions, so the direct emissions of an organisation, whether that be the fuel they burn or the electricity, it's also looking at their entire value chain, which looks at their supply chain and their customers. So this can be anything from emissions associated with the goods they purchase to their business travel, their employee commuting, but can also go down as far as the use of sold products, which I will come on to later on. So this is what a credible net zero strategy looks like. So it really starts with that reduction pathway. So we do this by calculating a business's emissions, look at where those carbon hotspots are, and then look at the opportunities that are available to reduce these emissions and keep that reduction in line with climate science. We then look at the removals pathway, which is in pink, and this looks to invest in projects that remove the remaining emissions so that that company can have net zero GHG emissions. One thing to note here is that there are always target dates, but for the removals pathway, the target date must keep going, otherwise those emissions will keep going up. So what are science-based targets? So to get that reductions pathway as an official science-based target, it must be approved by the Science-Based Target Initiative. In order to do this, there's a few criteria that the target must meet. So one of those is that the reduction pathway must be in line with climate science. So that's looking at it reaching well below 2 degrees, or ambitiously, we really push clients to try and get to that 1.5 degree pathway. In addition, the scope 3 emissions, if they make up more than 40% of the company's overall emissions, then they must be included in the target. So those scope 3 emissions are what I spoke about earlier. They're really wide ranging. So a lot of the time they do make up at least 80% of the overall emissions. So unless the company's in the manufacturing sector where scope 1 and 2 is really high, it's very likely that scope 3 needs to be included in their targets. So science-based targets really are one of the strongest and most credible ways a company can demonstrate their commitment to tackling climate change. This is really because it provides companies with a clearly defined pathway of by how much and how quickly they need to reduce their emissions. So these are just a few of the clients we've worked with over the past few years to set science-based targets and get those approved by the Science-Based Target Initiative. So on the left here we have their targets, and then on the right here we have, if they were to meet those targets, how much equivalent carbon that is in real terms. And I think this is really key because it really shows just how powerful and how material companies are, and why they are such key actors if we are to tackle climate change effectively. So when we're talking about scope 1 and 2 here, and then all these companies reducing it by 100%, they do this by procuring renewable energy supplies, whether that be natural gas or electricity for their sites, in order to meet their target. And then scope 3 is really where it gets more interesting. So if we take Nando's and reducing their footprint of a Nando's meal, they did this by, they did three things. So they looked to increase their plant-based options on their menus. They looked into investing in sustainable chicken production. And the third option, which we work with many clients to do, is to engage with their suppliers. So they engage with their suppliers to set their own science-based targets, which in turn would bring down their suppliers' emissions, which would then bring down Nando's Scope 3 emissions associated with those suppliers. The other interesting one here is Pucker. So when we calculated Pucker's value chain emissions, we actually found that a lot of their emissions fell within their use of sold products, so in their value chain Scope 3. And this is really because Pucker sells tea, and when they found that customers were boiling their kettles, that's where most of the emissions were coming from. And because they were boiling their kettles to drink their tea, it was falling into Pucker's Scope 3 emissions. So this is a really difficult one to try and control, because they can't tell people how often to boil their kettles, etc. But in order to kind of bring down these emissions effectively, they have started to join groups who are decarbonising the grid in order to bring down the emissions that are associated with the electricity that will be used when those kettles are boiled. Just to really finish off and bring it back to us, so we are Carbon Intelligence. We are a sustainability consultancy based in central London. We are a team of around 80 people who work across 60 countries. We're a team of data scientists, technologists, engineers and strategists. And I think what's really important to note here is we didn't all do environmental science or geography degrees at university. We did a range of degrees, so from history, maths, English, physics. And what's really brought us all together and why we work so effectively is because we all have the same passion for climate change. So it doesn't matter if that's not the degree you studied at university or that's not the career you started off in. As long as you have that interest, that's really all that is important. So our goal as a business is to help businesses to be ambitious and achieve their targets right across the world to instigate impactful change. Becoming a net zero business requires a coordinated approach that engages and raises ambition at every level. So our methodology is underpinned by the 6 dimensions of carbon intelligence, which we created in partnership with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And you can see that on the right of the screen. So this framework really focuses on 6 key elements necessary to deliver ambitious targets. And these dimensions really allow us to tailor a bespoke vision of success for clients based on their needs and their budget. And it really provides scope for growth to stretch their ambition and maintain that long-term momentum. So these are just a handful of the clients we've worked with, and we work across a number of sectors, including commercial real estate, food and hospitality, and professional services. So thank you very much for listening. Please send in any questions you may have to the Mock COP team, and one of the Carbon Intelligence team will be on the panel at the end of November and will be answer any that you may have.